All right, I've got the legend. He joins me. Very excited to have you. And before we get into the issues, I do want to ask you about congratulations. The paperback of your amazing book is out. And apparently, as I've been listening to the podcast and following you on Substack and Twitter, there are new chapters. American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed its People. It is out. You can get it. And congratulations. What's new in it?
Thanks, man. So the paperback addiction, the paperback edition has an additional chapter that deals with the January 6th insurrection, attempted coup, Trump's attempts to overthrow the election, and also the coronavirus pandemic. And we added that in there because those three things really encompassed what the book was talking about, which was this constant drumbeat towards authoritarianism, the destruction of open society, this radicalization along the right, and how a lot of what has happened in America over the last few years are repercussions of things that happened in our history. They're echoes of places that we've been, plus also right-wing white male attempts to regain the power and influence that they had before things like civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and voting rights as well. So yeah, it ended up being a pretty big coda for the entire book.
I feel like I believe and agree with you when you use this refrain, as well as others, about those of you who have forever and still think everything will be all right, everything's going to work out, are wrong. And which is why, I was just telling Jared off the air that I was being recruited to run for town council. Like, this is why I'm personally getting more involved. I don't know if I'll run or not, but it's a little too late. But it's not going to be all right. What do you mean by it's not going to be all right? And what have you been predicting and saying? How are we seeing some of these things play out?
Well, going back to the chapter, I think on January 20th, when Biden, of course, took the oath of office, there was this, I don't know how else to put it, but there was like this groundswell of an idea that finally, now that there was a president coming into office who wasn't Donald Trump, that he had been voted out, that it was just going to lead to this automatic renewal, to America. Meanwhile, like, the National Guard is camped outside of the entire ceremony. People are having to socially distance and wear masks. Things didn't get fixed on January 20th, right? In fact, we've actually seen things in a lot of ways grow worse over the past few months. This idea that things are just going to return, it basically treated Donald Trump like he was an aberration, like he was the disease, not a symptom of a larger disease. And we have been living in this really terrible, poisonous delusion that the only things wrong with America are things like Donald Trump being elected. And, if only Democrats will play hardball or whatever, when in fact we have a lot of institutional rot and decay that is leading us towards militarism, authoritarianism, fascism, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of people, I think, want to believe that things are just going to be okay because they're afraid of actually changing anything, because their wealth, their power, their influence, it all relies on those systems of power remaining intact.
My opinion has always been it's the media's fault. It's the media's fault. I even think Republicans would be a lot more reasonable because their big donors want them to be more reasonable on things like immigration. They would be way more reasonable. There aren't very many corporate interests who are anti-immigration. They want that cheap labor. They want to normalize it and so on. And Tucker Carlson went to Hungary, and you covered this extensively in your writing and on the podcast. And I talked here with Ruth Ben-Ghiat about it that week, but I think it's really important to stay focused on who the most influential people in media are and what they are saying. Because if you want to know what's kind of going to happen or what direction at least the right and to some extent the country's going, just listen to those guys because they really are telling you, I feel.
Yeah, there's a lot happening in all of that. So on one hand, you're exactly right that corporations do not care for a lot of the rhetoric that the Republicans are peddling. And it's not from an ideological purpose, but because corporations don't want to be branded as being regressive or oppressive, right? It actually knocks down on the amount of people who are going to buy their products. Meanwhile, a lot of the Republicans, you're exactly right, will rail against, immigration. Most of them don't have a problem. with immigration. Most of them are the people who want cheap labor to come up from the southern border, but they have to signal to their base, right? They have a lot of white Americans who are terrified and worried. So they have to make all of these continual appeals to that base to say, no, we're going to protect the border. We'll keep these things from happening. Meanwhile, they're like, come on in. We're going to pay you very, very little to get things done. The problem is that appeal from a lot of Republicans, right? The people that I think people who are more in denial would call them responsible Republicans or establishment Republicans. You know what I mean? Those people, by signaling to the base, are making it possible for people like a Tucker Carlson or a Stephen Miller to up the ante. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're afraid of people of color replacing white people? Guess what? We've got some solutions for that. And with somebody like Tucker Carlson, who, you know this, he's worked for every network that there is. He's changed his personality constantly, but he has finally settled on one that I think is his true self, which is a white supremacist. And by going over to Hungary and dealing with Viktor Orban and Orbanism in Hungary, he has made a case to the Republican base, which says, hey, you know how everybody's been telling you the apocalypse is coming and you're going to get your guns taken away, America's going to be replaced, white people are being replaced. Guess what? Over in Hungary, they figured it out. And all you have to do is overthrow elections, disenfranchise people, rein in the press, don't have any individual liberties anymore, and also go after and harass people. And they're like, look what Orban did over here. We can do that here, which is unfortunately what has been opened up by those appeals that we're talking about.
I think almost every Republican or conservative idea has been wrong, and I could criticize all of them. But I do think that Republican governors and even state houses were generally speaking not anti-vaccine. And the reason they became anti-vaccine is because it gets great ratings and it gets people scared when you are Alex Jones or even Joe Rogan now or others. And so that's what I mean by they're not trusting their own public health experts that they frankly appointed. There aren't, these aren't scientists. I mean, there are some quacks, obviously, and they get signal boosted by these right wingers. But that's an example of what I mean. Like, they're not listening to sane experts there because they're being driven by the media.
Well, and I live in Georgia, and Georgia is a really good example of what's happening here. I'm actually working on an article right now about this. You have a governor like Brian Kemp, right? And Brian Kemp, when he got elected, people might not remember this, but he surfed on that Trump wave. Like, he wanted it bad. And the way that he won the primary and eventually the governorship, besides stealing it from Stacey Abrams, is he would do all these ads where he's like posing with shotguns and, getting in his big truck, and he's going to, quote, round up illegals and drive them to the border. He's the governor of Georgia. And in Georgia, we have a lot of corporations, including Coca-Cola, Delta. Then on top of it, you've got Hollywood, who has made Georgia basically its second home in America. So he has to do two things at once, right? He has to signal to the Trump base, which has all but rejected him at this point, while also maintaining a pro-business, semi-progressive environment, right? So you have Brian Kemp, who the other day shut down Georgia government to allow people to go and get vaccinated, but he can't talk about it too much, right? He can't do the mask mandates. He can't do any of that stuff. He has to straddle both worlds. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis is not straddling any worlds. He's making his decision that he wants to be the next president of the United States. So as a result, he has to push pedal to the metal. We're not doing masks. We're not doing vaccines. I don't care how many children die. But it's because of that, because they want to be seen as the embodiment of that rhetorical appeal that we're talking about.
That rhetorical appeal being the constant screaming and fear mongering from influential people in media. This overwhelmingly on the right, I would say.
Exactly. And so, like, with somebody like a DeSantis is trying to sell himself as the guy who's going to take Trump's torch, but he'll be more competent, right? He's not going to do all of the Trumpian sort of stuff that Trump did, but he'll go ahead, he'll do pro-business, he'll go ahead and say that experts don't know what they're talking about. He'll push ivermectin if you want him to, whatever you want him to do, but he'll be more professional than Trump was. But what we're actually watching, and I think we talked about this when we were on here with Waj a while back, This environment in right-wing media constantly pushes further and further right because of marketing demographics.
Yeah.
Because that's how you keep people watching. That's how you keep people investing. It's the terror of it. They're going to put you in camps. They're going to take your guns. They're going to hand your wife over to the New World Order. People of color are going to show up in your neighborhood and bring about, Sharia law or whatever they want to make up. And so what you have and what we've seen is an evolution on the right where you went from a bunch of people like a Newt Gingrich, right? And Newt Gingrich was like a pro-business Looney Tune, but he also started appealing to like militia groups and talking about the New World Order. And that, of course, leads to the Tea Party, and that leads to Trumpism. And this next evolution isn't necessarily going to be people who are just appealing to that. We have a lot of people who believe in this shit, and a lot of people who are like living it and breathing it and existing within it. So it's a long, tireless march to the right, for sure.
Years ago, I interviewed both Tucker Carlson and Newt Gingrich at separate times. Newt a couple times, I think, and I'll never forget because I was no match for them. It was no match. I mean, granted, I was a lot dumber and less experienced, but I don't know that I would be today. I mean, Gingrich came into my studio and just threw me right off. He knew exactly what he was doing. They're very, very effective communicators, and they know how to, get people absolutely fired up and terrified. Which brings me to what's happening. I think I didn't agree with some of your predictions about how things were going to play out because I couldn't see them. I don't think that you could specifically see them either, and you would throw out a lot of hypotheticals. But now one of the kind of hypotheticals that I think that you were talking about is happening, and I'm wondering how closely you're paying attention to it because I fear it's the most important thing, which is at the school level where the Board of Education is made up of volunteers. Nobody's going to want to volunteer if people are physically threatening them and their families and live in that community with them. At my own board, I'm not saying that's happened in terms of the threats, but we've seen it in other places. But at our meeting I went to, and folks have been listening to me last week know about this, and it was crazy. And all the things that you've heard nationally, I heard right here in my town about ivermectin or ivermectin or horse shit, whatever they're taking, all the way to CRT. And I'm wondering how closely you're paying attention to on the local level, these schools and what the strategy there is.
Oh, I think it's the canary in the coal mine. And, we on the Muckrake podcast, we talk a lot about this through the lens of Howard Beale on the 1970s movie Network. Yeah. And there's this moment where Howard Beale, who is this pundit or news anchor who goes insane on the air, at one point he starts screaming, you know what? Eventually you just go in your home and you say, leave me alone. You can do whatever you want. Just leave me alone in my own home. And that's sort of where we're reaching at this point. Open society is being shredded to the point where if you are a doctor, if you are a scientist, or if you're an elected official, you basically at this point are being absolutely assaulted, intimidated, and stalked by people who are being radicalized and pointed like a weapon by a very specific right-wing movement. And in this case, whether it's CRT or masks, all of these made-up outrages, right? These are being pushed by right-wing think tanks. These are people, by the way, who are like academics who are studied, all of these people who get in a room and they say, okay, we need to get people to do X, right? How do we get people to do X? And obviously the answer is always intimidation or fear, right? So how do we take over school boards? How do we make sure that we can indoctrinate the future? How do we control curriculum? Well, let's create this critical race theory outrage, which, by the way, wasn't about CRT. It was about a phrase that sounded scary, right? That encompassed all these ideas.
Yeah, I feel like I heard you guys talking about it kind of being astroturfed, right? I mean, this guy from the Manhattan Institute, Rufo or whatever, that was the most effective thing that I've seen the right do in years. And we'll talk about abortion in a minute, but is that right? It's kind of like,
yeah. So what happens, the way that the right wing works at this point, because so far we've been talking about politicians, and politicians are more or less the PR agents of this movement, right? And you're exactly right with Newt Gingrich. Like, Newt Gingrich is a brilliant person who never understood that he needed to shut up every now and then and not say everything that entered into his mind. Like, he's an incredibly smart dude, but then the next thing you know, he's talking about moon bases.
Yeah.
Right. he goes too far. But now they have been replaced by people who have no idea what they're talking about. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene that has no grasp of like public policy. Madison Cawthorn has no grasp on public policy. We have people who go out and they're very good at grifting off of this fear. Meanwhile, the people who are actually pulling the strings among the Republican Party and the right wing are what we would call libertarian billionaires, right? These are the people that are encompassed by people like the Koch brothers and how they created the Tea Party. So they funnel millions, if not billions of dollars into universities, think tanks, all these different groups. And they say, hey, we want lower taxes. And they're like, oh, that's great. We'll tell everyone the New World Order is coming. You know, and so eventually what happens is they astroturf all of these movements. The CRT outrage, the mask movement, all of that is about taking over school boards, and it's about changing the curriculum. So what your children are taught isn't real history, isn't real economics, isn't, you know, and you keep them pliable. So what we're actually talking about is a multi-tiered movement that, and by the way, like this isn't tinfoil hat stuff. This isn't smoky rooms. Like this is all on the record, all very obvious if you know where to look for it. And so what we're watching is that this fear mongering is being used to try and pursue X or Y as a means.
Which leads me to the other big issue, that big win for the right on abortion, which they've been working on for over 30 years. And we can talk about its origins and how that also became a way to get people fired up. And I mean, everybody does this, but taking an issue and creating this wedge issue, which wasn't really before. I mean, the problem is, I feel like on the right, certainly they just manufacture things and then they just test them and they work and they're really making up a lot of things. Whereas, you know, on the left, we're like screaming about the importance of diversity and inclusion, or more importantly about science like climate, and they just deny it, or they deny COVID even. And so it always works. And tell me, you know, your thoughts on the win they had in Texas and the Supreme Court on abortion, because it's just so emblematic of so much of what you've been writing about.
Well, I want to go ahead and start with the history of abortion in this country, which is, most people don't understand this, but it wasn't that controversial when it actually occurred. There was a consensus among Democrats and Republicans that this probably should be legal, or at least Republicans thought that it was a losing issue. But what ends up happening is that the evangelical right, and most people don't know this, the animating issue on the evangelical right was not abortion. The original was desegregation. It was when all of a sudden they started making sure that schools were desegregated. And they actually, this is why you have all these private schools, is you have a bunch of segregation academies that started figuring out how to get away from the federal government telling them that they had to desegregate and make, you know, equal circumstances. So eventually they figure out that abortion makes for a really good cudgel issue. And the whole point here, and why we've seen this become the issue that it is it goes back to everything that we're watching now, like QAnon, which is, oh, they're not just corrupt, they're not just bad politicians, they're killing people. You know, they're drinking blood, they're doing this. With abortion, they turn it much more into almost like a moral apocalypse, right? And they realized, all these think tanks and all these experts realized, that it polled well among the right. It hit the right buttons, it made the right fears. So what's happening in Texas is also incredibly concerning, because you have to understand that the law is a social construct. It's just a thing that we all agreed on and was, you know, construed and constructed in a certain way. They now have the Supreme Court, which they stole, to make sure that any progress, any reform is going to be deemed unconstitutional. And meanwhile, any of these legal or illegal fictions that they come up with, which is what happened in Texas. This law was created and crafted in such a way that the Supreme Court was like, we're not going to overturn Roe v. Wade, but you just found a loophole, in which, of course, was about citizens turning people in, right? The state's not doing it, the citizens are doing it. And immediately we knew what was going to happen, which was every right-wing state in the country was like, oh, there it is. We're going to do that. Done. We're going to go and do that. So they've actually turned the law into their political weapon, and they have stalked the entire judiciary in the same way that they're now trying to stalk what we were just talking about, the school boards and the local commissions around this country. It was about creating their own backstop for power.
Yeah, and they've done a really effective job at that. The Fifth Circuit was, of course, the court that, and apparently that's pretty weighted with conservative justices appointed by conservative. Pretty wild. A lot of their judgments and outcomes allowing this to happen. So, you know, where do we go from here on abortion and on what's next at the local level. I talked with Lala Wu of Sister District yesterday, and she, or last week, and she just talked about the strategy that Republicans have had for years to take over state houses, which they've been amazingly successful at. And it's hard to see progressives, much less, rank and file Democrats, doing that, making gains, certainly in red states where they've been so gerrymandered at state level. What do you think, where we go from here on that?
Well, the left has just fallen behind in terms of local and regional politics. That's been constant. The Republicans have outworked them in places where people didn't want to run, or they didn't want to organize, or that they, didn't necessarily have a conducive message. The problem here is that the Republican Party is historically unpopular at a federal level, at a national level. They really, along this current trajectory that they're on, particularly with the appeals that we've been talking about, they're not going to win except for things like the Electoral College and gerrymandering and disenfranchising. In this case, I think what we're watching with abortion is what a lot of us have been predicting for a while, which is that it's going to be hollowed out. They're not necessarily going to overturn Roe v. Wade. One of the long-going things among the Republican Party, and Reagan was the one who had this quote that is consistently echoed throughout history. When he got elected, someone's like, okay, you're going to get rid of Roe v. Wade, right? And he was like, are you crazy? I wouldn't get rid of Roe v. Wade. Like, it helps with fundraising. It helps with power. And on top of that, do you want a bunch of people in the streets? You know what I mean? Like, do you want people actually protesting against this and organizing around it? What we're probably going to watch is this fictional legal idea, or the loophole that the Texas Republicans discovered. We're probably going to see Roe v. Wade hollowed out like a cavity, to the point where, red states, or so-called red states, are going to make sure that abortion is all but made completely illegal. And the idea, I think, that they're betting on is that people in blue states and or purple states are just going to leave it alone. And they're going to be like, okay, Roe v. Wade's still there. It's not infringing on me. That's the bet that I think the Republican Party is making, is that they can create these pockets of control in these red states. But I don't know that that's necessarily the truth. I mean, I've seen increased activity. I've seen a lot more energy in the past few days in reproductive rights than I've seen in many, many years.
Yeah, for sure. I hope that they've gone yet again too far, which is what the election of Donald Trump was, the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh. Activists and movements need to be, what would be the phrase to talk about how they keep the momentum. I don't want to be disrespectful to them, but it's hard to get, to recruit people to show up if it seems like everything's going okay, but you can't deny the elections, and you can't deny big, huge national stories like this in Texas. I hope it means they've gone too far on this issue, and it means they makes it harder for them to take back, say, the House or even the Senate in the midterms. That's what I hope, but I don't know.
Yeah, and if you actually look at this country right now, I kind of feel like, and I know, surprise, surprise, our media misses the narrative constantly. Basically, American politics has explained that 45% of the country is Democratic, 45% is Republican, and then there's like 10% independent, and they're just constantly battling over those 10%. That's not true. The Republican Party is deeply, deeply unpopular right now. And going back to the idea of abortion, like, the overwhelming majority of Americans think that it should be a legal right. It's a vast majority that believe that. This is not a popular thing. I think it is being seen as taking a step too far, or some sort of an offensive maneuver. The question at this point isn't necessarily if that's going to lead to a pushback in whether or not it's congressional seats or Senate seats. Because with Trumpism, particularly, I'm about to say post-Trump, but is anything ever post-Trump? You know what I mean? Like, he's probably going to run in 2024. His influence is still very strong. But the further and further that the Republican Party goes right, the more unpopular they're going to be, which is going to lead to a crisis for the party, which is, if you're not going to win elections anymore, and you do have a certain amount of power in certain places, what do? And what history tells us you do is you oppress, you intimidate, and you overthrow democratic institutions. So that is, unfortunately, the trajectory that we're on. And I think people who believe that things are just going to be okay are sort of looking beyond the horizon, thinking, well, if they lose enough races, they'll have to figure this out. But that is not who the Republican Party is.
Yeah. I want to spend this last part of our conversation talking about national security as it relates to the end of the Afghan war. Had Spencer Ackerman on the show a few weeks ago. I think his book pretty much covers it all. I think Andrew Bazovich's book covers it as well. He goes even further back and talking about kind of the war in the Middle East and so on. But last night I had what I thought was a clever tweet. I think it got 4 to 7 likes. But basically, I watched the 9/11 doc last night. This one that was on Apple TV. It's pretty good. Talked to all the Bush administration people and got their point of view on the day, which I think was good journalism, despite I hate all of them. And I kept, living through 9/11, being in New York and all of that went with it for me personally, and my home, my city, and the reaction to it. It's all worth discussing right now as we're headed, to the 20th anniversary and the end of Afghanistan. But Jared, before I even got to it, my tweet was like, I'm watching this 9/11 doc and I can't stop thinking about how nobody really cares or thinks much about the fact that Russia interfered in our election in 2016. The reaction to 9/11 is something that we can and should talk about a lot. The lack of a reaction to the interference in our election by Russia seems like something we should still be continuing to discuss. And I feel like there's not a lot of discussion or investigation into it, and that concerns me. What do you think of should I not even juxtapose the two?
No, I think there's a lot of stuff that could be juxtaposed with 9/11. And going back to the idea of the media, one of the reasons why 9/11 was such a seminal event, besides the fact that it was obviously a massive national tragedy, is that it was such a massive national, international spectacle. One of the things about 9/11, and you'll notice that a lot of what these documentaries are talking about is watching it on the TV, experiencing it, seeing the second plane hit the tower. How did it feel when it occurred? And when you start to look at that and you start to actually take in consideration who Al-Qaeda was, how they were able to do this stuff. I want to say that the cost of the attacks of 9/11 were like $600,000. And what did it cause? It caused the Iraq War, Afghanistan.
You don't mean $600,000. You mean?
Oh, no, I'm talking about the cost of Al-Qaeda, how much it cost for Al-Qaeda to pull it off.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant like the damage or something.
Well, but that's my whole point is
yes.
Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and their financiers, I think they spent like $600,000 to pull off this wildly ambitious terrorist attack. And the entire point was to drag the United States of America into a prolonged conflict, to spend its money, to spend its blood, to spend its political capital. And we responded with trillions of dollars. We killed, God, we don't know how many people we've killed. We've been active in hundreds of countries around the world, and we still can't even come out and say maybe we need to take a step back from that. Our media, by the way, over the past couple of weeks has been hyperventilating, and in a weird consensus, they are all saying the exact same thing, which is, oh, we botched Afghanistan, leaving there. Like, shouldn't we still be there? Shouldn't that still be occurring? And the whole point of it, and it goes back to your point, is that we have so many problems, Pete, that we're not taking a look at. Like, it just came out today that unemployment benefits are going to run out. We have a bunch of people getting ready to get kicked out of their rented homes. The economy is falling apart. Not to mention that you want to talk about spectacles. New York City was underwater.
Yeah.
Like water everywhere. People were drowning in their basement apartments. And that was in New York City, the media capital of the world. And people have already kind of forgotten it. You know what I mean? Like now it just kind of didn't happen. The whole point is that we live in an accelerated environment where we have multiple crises that we can't pay attention to. Also, our elections and the infrastructure of our democracy. Yeah. Those things cannot compare to a Tuesday morning, towers on fire, people screaming, giant clouds of smoke, the Pentagon in flames. It was a rhetorical appeal that continues to echo through history, and we still aren't able to deal with it or any of the problems that it has compounded or hides now.
Yeah, you guys did a good job also covering the outcome of the latest IPCC study on climate change. I was like on vacation that week and have been pretty much looking away from it, but you just barely touched on that with the horrible storm in New York and obviously, down south as well. And it's just crazy to see the Northeast underwater and the West is burning and not have more coverage. It's just such a big, giant issue. And I guess it just doesn't get the kind of ratings that certainly Afghanistan and so many other issues do. So you don't see as much coverage. It's hard to talk about for people, but that's important
Well, I
issue.
just want to say that I'm also worried about that as well, because going back to the consensus within the media we were just talking about, it's nonstop talk about Afghanistan, about the decline of American power. Meanwhile, we have all these other issues that are taking place that aren't necessarily getting the attention and focus that they deserve. The thing that I'm terrified of, and this goes back to the post-Trumpian world and the further march to the right, I think Republicans are going to figure out that their only ticket to regaining power is by attacking Joe Biden, Afghanistan, the idea of American empire, redeeming American power, going more militant, going more towards jingoism and chauvinism. And I have to tell you, and I think you know this as well, there are plenty in the media who are going to march right along with that tune. Who are going to be more than happy to have a Republican who talks about flags and eagles and tanks and jet carriers, but are turned off by Donald Trump saying stupid shit and being an embarrassment.
I don't know. I have a hard time imagining American public opinion supporting a foreign intervention as large as we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, it wouldn't take much of an event. And it would be weird, too, because you have these domestic terrorists all the time. So many, by the way, it's so not politically correct to talk about, but I don't give a shit. So many of these domestic terrorists are former military, Army and Marines, especially. I just read about this Marine who he was a sniper, and he just killed 4 people yesterday. I mean, like, it's really, but the idea of a military intervention in a foreign country, it seems hard to wrap my head around how we could continue doing that even with Republican leadership. I don't know. How do you see it?
Well, I think one of the things that we don't really talk about much is how a superpower recovers from something like that. Like, eventually what ends up happening is you have this thing called revanchism that starts to sort of take over, which is like a lust for revenge or the idea of, a renewal. One of the reasons Ronald Reagan was able to gain the support that he did was he completely revisioned Vietnam. He went out and he said, you know what? We didn't lose the war. It was our generals who lost the war. Right. It was the protesters who lost the war. And, this is the thing that you carry around and it makes you ashamed or it makes you question being an American. Don't question being American, because once we feel a certain way as a nation, we're very quick to change the narrative and go in the opposite direction. It's the reaction and action. And in this case, I think things are ripe right now for the Republican Party sort of picking up that mantle. If they're smart, if they're worried about winning politics, that's like one of their few directions they can go in. I'm just hoping they don't figure that out.
Anything hopeful? Anything to be hopeful about here at the end?
I like you. I think what happened in Texas was an overplaying of a hand. And I think it made obvious very, very quickly the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court as well as the Republican Party. They have no plan, no platform for making anybody's life better. The only thing that they can offer people is to prosecute and hurt the people that they don't like. And in this case, they did an incredibly unpopular thing. And I keep hoping that the outrage from it is going to turn into organization and some sort of an action from the grassroots level.
I don't know what the most effective messaging is. And I know this part of the law that allows people to turn people in, this vigilantes people are talking about, that's kind of unprecedented, it would seem. Maybe you've been studying history, I know, for your next book, but I kind of feel like the messaging should just be rape and incest. We know that most people, even that are anti-abortion, are not for that. Most people, maybe that's different, maybe I'm wrong, but I would just stay focused on even in cases of rape and incest.
Yeah, and the problem there is, of course, that people don't want to put that on a banner. You know what I mean? Like the issue there is that it doesn't really pass the media test.
I'm gonna make T-shirts. Where are you on rape and incest?
That's the shirt.
I wasn't done with it. It's gonna have other things.
Okay, so it's going to have more talking points on it. That's good. But I will say, though, that one of the things that we're going to find out over the next couple of years with these laws is that countries like the United States of America, they love turning in their neighbors. They love turning in their neighbors. And we've seen it. We've seen it throughout history that right-wing movements and counter-revolutionary movements, they love turning the people against each other.
My neighbor turned me in for my shed.
I didn't know that.
You didn't hear about that? I had to take down like part of my shed. My neighbor turned me in. I didn't even know. It was up for 12 years, and she just had to take it down. Awful. Yeah, and she's.
Well, I mean, right? It's already happening, is what I'm saying. But we love that, and one of the reasons that the right wing loves doing that is because it erases any solidarity. You know what I mean? Is it causes people to not trust one another. It causes alienation. It causes atomization of society, which is where the right wing thrives. They cannot have people comparing notes and working together and organizing and forming communal trust, which goes back to the school boards. It goes back to local government. When people don't work together, that fear mongering, that sort of paranoia that they depend on, that's where that takes seed. But as soon as people trust each other and work together, that's the antidote to it.
So great to talk to you, man. I missed talking to you. It's been a few weeks, and I've been love listening to the podcast, and everybody else should too, as well as subscribe to the Substack, support the Patreon, and definitely, if you haven't already bought the book, and even if you have, it's got new chapters, get the book. It's out in paperback. When is it available? Like, when will it come to my house? American
September
Rule.
14th. September 14th.
You've joined me so many times here. Please go. There's a lot of ways to support Jared's work. But go buy that's I think the longest form I can get you in is my favorite form.
You're the best. Thank you, Pete.